Hey, what's up? In this video I'm going to show you how I made this wind vegetation shader that I think can be really useful for games when you have like lots of vegetation and you want to tie it together, right? So they're all using the same shader, but they're reacting based on world positions. In this way you can get like a nice cohesive movement, and that looks a lot more like wind, which is of course always tying everything together in the world. So there are lots of ways here to customize this. Well, of course, the wind, this is the wind direction. It also uses magnitude. So for some reason, if I want like really fast wind, maybe a little bit too fast to look realistic. But you can definitely go from like a very nice, like super gentle summer breeze to like a crazy storm. It feels like it's almost about to, well, where the barn should fly away. I guess crops don't really fly away if it's stormy. And yeah, lots of variation, right? So we can here say how strong we want the wind to have some variations. We have a bit of jitter we can play around with. Then there is, of course, the wind strength in itself. So if I maybe make the strength down a bit here, maybe don't go this crazy. Now I had a lot of bend, right? This is how much I want them to bend. So lots and lots of ways to customize this. Let me make this a bit stronger. And of course, if you want to have an alien invasion, then you need to have like a crop circle sign. So we also have this, right? So I can put in any texture here and then place this onto the world position. And here I just added like a little bit of sparkles. I'm also going to show you how I did that in the shader. And then we can review the sign, and now all the crops are flattened wherever we want to show this texture. Right, we can of course scale this, make it smaller, bigger. We can rotate it. We could even animate it, maybe in a future video. But yeah, for now, let me show you how I did this one here. Okay, so this is the shader, and it might look a little bit complex. It's actually more complex than it needs to be right now because I didn't use subgraph, so I could definitely trim it down a bit. But for the sake of the tutorial, I figured I just keep it in, and sometimes things repeat themselves, right? But if I use a subgraph, then you don't really see what's going on inside. You always have to click around, show a different window, and so on. So I figured I leave it as that. I'm not going to go through every single node and every single connection here in this video. That would take like 2 hours and would be incredibly hard to follow. Instead, I decided I just uploaded this thing here to GitHub, so you can just grab it, play around with the shader. There are a bunch of variations in here too. Right, I have one that's only the wind, and this is the one with the VFX. I mean, chances are you don't always want like alien signs inside the vegetation, but if you do, then there's this crops wind signs VFX. In this video, I'm just going to go through some of the basic principles, explain to you how it works. And if you still have questions, just let me know in the comments. Also have a Discord server if you want to join there and ask me, and then I'll do my best to help you answer any questions about this one here. On a little side note, if you do grab the project from GitHub, don't make the field yourself. There is a field creator somewhere. Oh yeah, let's see, field spawner, right? Okay, so just use this. Don't place every crop by hand. That would take a lot of time. But instead, what you can do is there's this field spawner here, and you can say how big you want to have the field. And then you just right click and say create field, and there's your field, right? It's not perfect right now, but for the most part it creates a fence around it, and you can set the the size, the density, and a bunch of things. So do this. Don't place like 50,000 crops by hand. That will take a lot of time. Okay, so at the core of this shader is basically we take a plant, right, like this, and we want to get it flat on the ground, and we can do that by rotating 90 degrees around the X and Z axis. This is pretty much it. And this is what these rotate about axis does. And instead of kind of plugging in the rotation directly, or rather have the rotation variable that I can set, I kind of hard coded it to 90 degrees because I know it's going to be straight at the beginning and 90 degrees will be flat on the ground. And then to drive all of this, I'm using this lerp node, right? So I have the original position. So this is the object position. So every vertex position relative to its space. I'm doing a bit of adding here for stretching. We can get into that in a moment. Right, so I have this original position and I have this modified position, and I'm lerping in between of those. And I do this so like when when I plug in 0, I just want to have the original position that's going to be straight standing up. If I plug in 1, then they're going to be flat on the ground, and so everything in between. Lerp is not clamped, so just to make sure that it's only between 0 and 1, I use the saturate node. That's what it does. It's basically clamp 0, 1. Because if I plug in 2, then they would rotate by 180 degrees. They would be upside down inside the ground, and that kind of sucks. Okay, so let's do some wind bending shader 101, and that is, of course, you don't want to have them like rotate like this, right? That's not really this, more like they've been cut off and then fell over like a wooden door or something. It's not very crop-like. So basically every plant, I would guess, is stronger on the bottom and more flexible on the top. So obviously you want to bend more on the top. And we can do this here, like we have this like 90 degrees, that's the maximum. And we say, so when we plug in 1, we get 90 degrees. So this would be whatever is 1, that's flat on the ground. And so we can say, let's do less when on the top. Now the standard wind shader that I've seen quite a lot is, you just have like a gradient. You say like, wait, let me go here. Oops, so like the higher this is of the plant, can I not move? Okay, so if it's, now we go. So if it's higher, we want to rotate more. If it's lower, we want to rotate less, and that would be good enough for a lot of use cases. If you want to have it flat on the ground, you just want to have like more control over it. So what then you kind of want to rotate almost everything flat on the ground except for like the bottom part, right? Because that wouldn't look realistic, then it's uprooted. So what I did, I take the position. I only care about the height, right? So the Y value. So position, object position. Where is each vertex relative to the pivot? The pivot here is on the bottom. So I split this because I only care about the Y value. I remap this between a range from 0 to whatever I define as the height, because everything is different, right? This happens to be between 0 and 2. Right, so I can just set it here. Okay, this one is 2, so I plug in 2, and then I say Y value, convert this 0 to 2 to a range between 0 and 1, because that makes things so much easier. And you might have things that are higher, like 0 and 4, so you would say plug in 4, and you still get like 0 to 1. It's almost like a percentage, like how high is this vertex relative to the entire height of the plant, or the mesh to be precise. And then I saturate it just in case. I might say it's only 2 units high, but in reality there are vertices way higher than this. And then this remap would give me a value way higher, between 1. And then, as you can see, then we end up getting way more than 90 degrees. And once again, we are straight in the ground. So just make sure saturate. This clamps it between 0 and 1. Here I have this gradient because I don't want to have this like straight like 0 and then 1 on the top and then like everything in between. What I want for this case, to have them flat on the ground, to have no rotation on the bottom, and then really quickly already here right location. So at 12% of the height, I already want them to be able to fully rotate flat on the ground, and then the rest is just 1. And I'm using the alpha because it's easier to use the alpha slider, right? So I use this gradient here and I plug this in, right? When I say when I plug in 0, it's going to give me the alpha value at this stage, 0.5 in the middle, and if I plug in 1, it's going to give me the alpha value of this. Right, technically it's going to give me the color, but I split it and I only care about the alpha value. And even though here it says 0 and 255, what of course it's going to give me is a value between 0 and 1. And so I can plug this in and say bottom don't rotate at all, and then quite quickly everything else rotate by 90 degrees, because that way I can get them flat on the ground. And that is very important if you want to have them cut off, or you might want to have aliens make crop signs in your crop field. But now, of course, if I use this wind strength slider and I do this, right, then every crop is just gonna, in perfect choreography, gonna go flat on the ground. That doesn't look like wind at all. So what we want to do, or rather there are two things we want to do. One, we don't want all of them to behave exactly the same way in terms of time. So we want to play with this wind strength a bit, right? I still want to have this as a slider here, but as you can see, there's variation in it, right? So they take that value, but some are say, let's add a bit more, let's add a bit less, add a bit more, add a bit less. And as you can see, this is also moving, and this is what's gonna make this look a lot more like wind. The other thing we should talk about is, well, if I rotate this, let's go back here. Well, obviously if I rotate like, come on, like this, it doesn't look very plant-like. It looks a lot more like something very sturdy. Once again, like a barn door, that would kind of fall like this. As I mentioned before, you might be good enough already, just use a gradient, and then it's gonna do this bend. Once again, you're not gonna get them on the ground, and then how can you have aliens make crop signs in it? So for this to also have a bend, I did a bunch of things. So there are a bunch of things we can do to, let's talk about the bending first, and that is not the sign. Higher parts. Oh yeah, so this is what I decided to do. One of the things, actually two things, but let me explain this. So I said here lerp higher parts sooner, right? This way I can say if I plug in like a wind strength of 0.2, but I say, you know what, if it's 0.2, I want the higher parts to already be at 0.3. And this way I can still get this nice bend effect, and also have a bend variable here. See if I do a little bit, and if I bend this more, then of course the higher parts are gonna get to 0 much faster. And as you can see, this is why it's so useful to only use this lerp value, because I can say I want to have a lot of bend just added. It's almost like even when there's no wind, right? I'm adding a lot of bend, so I'm saying the higher parts already want them to. It kind of looks like they're stuck to the ground, they're like sticky and trying to get up. So you know, lots of use cases for this shader. But yeah, the power of this is that they're not gonna bend into the ground here, because all I'm saying is the higher the vertex is here. So once again, I'm pretty sure, come on, yes, okay. I just showed you the original height, right? I take the Y position, relative 0 to 1, saturated. So I also use this here, multiply this with this bend value, right? So the lower parts, well, I multiply 0 with bend, so it's always going to be 0. And the higher parts, then they're going to get bigger and bigger. And then I just add this here. And this gradient is not connected at all, because I had this nice one, and yeah, it's a big shader, it's not perfect yet. Let's ignore that then. So we're just adding some bend. We're saying the higher parts, we want to have them sooner. So this is, of course, I could use this to fine tune the curvature and all of these things. But yeah, I think this is what matters here, right? So I have this bend, and this goes, I'm adding one, which doesn't make much sense now, but yeah. I multiply this, and I multiply this with the wind strength, right? That is the slider that determines how much they're gonna be bent down already. So wind is 0. I hope it's not too confusing. Wind is the direction and the velocity. Wind strength, maybe you should have called it something that determines how wind reaction. No, that's even worse of a word. What I'm trying to say is how much they're going to bend inside the wind, right? Because obviously you could have a plant that's like really strong. The speed, it's still gonna react to the speed, right? The way it's gonna jitter, and it's on all of that, and of course the direction. But some things like a crop, they're a bit weaker, so they just get bent a lot more. And then we had 1, so now they're completely flat, because now it's so windy that nothing moves at all. Yeah, or maybe not. But yeah, so with this bend we can, right, we are lerping the higher parts sooner, and we're just plugging this in, right? We're multiplying what we're getting out of here. We're gonna get into this in a moment. So the wind strength, we're adding some bunch of stuff to this, but here this is where it matters, right? The higher parts sooner. So we multiply it, I clamp it to 0 and 9, and we're adding some, wait, no, that's the crop sign. We're gonna get to that in a moment. Once again, this is where it all leads into this lerp node, and by increasing the value, if the vertex is high up on the object, it's gonna get a higher value here, so I multiply it, And of course, always clamping. Oh yeah, I did this. I clamped it to 0 and 0.9 to have this like, to make sure that it's the crop sign, the circle, which we're gonna get to in a moment too. That's the one that's gonna push it all the way to 1, right? So it's almost like whatever I do here with the wind, it can only get it to 0.9, so that like almost on the ground. But then when I add the crop sign stuff, then they can get flat on the ground. Okay, so this is one way to have this curvature in here, right? So it already looks, actually looks like quite strong. So if I say the bend, maybe not this much. And of course, you could adjust this to the wind strength, right? I think ultimately to make this look good, you kind of need a script that controls all these values. Also bending, I move the tip down a little bit when bend, not gonna get into this, but once again, I play around with like how high they are. Then I can actually say if they're already bent, then maybe have them bent down even more. I think I actually do this on how far they are from the center. But as I mentioned, I can't go through every single thing in here. So let's talk about one of the way more important things. And that is obviously we don't want all of them to move exactly the same, right? As you can see here, it's like a wind is never like this complete uniform force. There's always this variation in there. And right now what I explained to you, they would all move exactly the same with a nice curvature, but still way too similar. So a bunch of things we can do here. And the most important thing is basically the wind strength. And to add some variation to that, right? We have this here, but I want to add this. And you might be able to tell it is a noise texture that we are adding here. And of course, we want to add the noise texture based on the world. So it's kind of like, you know what, I can even, when I make this really extreme, let me see. Let's make the wind strength. No, not the wind strength. The wind strength variation, this is how much like kind of gets added and not. So if I make this incredibly strong, well, you can see this is a noise texture that is scrolling around. And then of course I have values for frequency, which is really just the scale, right? So that looks kind of cool. And then of course if I make this bigger, and it goes like this. And I'm using one for like the overall and one for the jitter. Okay, so we need to get the noise texture kind of onto the ground, right? So we have this X and Z here, that is the ground. And the noise texture only takes X and Y value, right? So kind of like this. So then the Z would be the Y value and the X can stay the X. And we're doing that. Let's look at this first. So first we map the wind direction XZ to a UV, X and Y. So I take the wind, the X, Y, Z, split it. So the X becomes the negative Y. Honestly, the reason why is because I looked at the scene and then it was kind of obvious, okay, this is how to do it. I wish I could tell you more intuitively or maybe more advanced math, but this just works, right? Now I have the X and Z to a UV, X and Y. And I, of course, multiply this with the time node, so this makes them move. So what I do here is only the offset, right? So I have this like 2 nodes just to show it to you. Not plugged into anything here, but then I have this noise and now they're scrolling. And of course, if I make the wind like 10 times, like the X like 10 and Z 10, then this would move a lot faster. So this is why this is the direction as well as the wind speed. Here we have the direction variation. We can talk about that in a moment. So first things first, like we want to have some things stronger. So what we need to do first is figure out, okay, we are doing it for every vertex to be precise, and say where's that vertex in the world position, right? So I split it to the X and Z because now I want to map this onto the X, Y, and Z. I only care about the X and Z value, right? So this, once again, this is now the world alignment. So for every crop, I say where is your X and Z position. And I take this X and Z and make it into a X and Y vector 2. And the reason is, of course, for all these noise, because once again, they only take X and Y. And I have the wind strength variation frequency. Once again, this is how much it's going to jitter. I just showed you that. I divided by 10, just so it's a bit easier to set in the inspector. And then I multiply what I got out of this here. You might say, why not use this for the scale of the noise texture? And the reason is, if we do that and we end up with a really small scale, like, 0.86, we're barely getting any values. If I map the entire world to this, then that's just not going to look good. So it should be at least something like, at least 1, I think. No, 1 is not enough. So let's say 10. And then it's just easier to divide this. So say instead of mapping like this 10 unit onto noise texture, I want to map a, if I divide it, if I say this is 10, then I would say like map 100 times 100 texture onto this one example we're seeing here. And that means we're still getting all these values. We're just not limited to, if we change the scale, right, then, well, it might be completely black. And yeah, and then this is the wind strength variation, right? So we're mapping this onto a texture for the offset. Once again, we're using this, what we just did here, the movement. So this is actually moving. Fortunately, it's not very nice to see. It's, Shadow Graph doesn't always give you a perfect preview here. Anyhow, we take the wind strength variation, divide by 10. Once again, just doing this to make it a bit easier to set in the inspector. And I want to remap this. So what we're getting out of this noise is kind of like 0 to 0.7. And I want the variation to go in both directions, but only have one value to set it here. And that's why I say once, I negate it. And so this is like X and Y, right? And I take this into the out. So if I plug in like a wind strength variation of 3, this is gonna give, say, map this simple noise of 0.08, which is not correct. It's more like this. That's what the noise texture gives you. So 3, then I would say, okay, so -3 to 3. This is vector 2, right? So we map this, because then that's kind of old. We don't need that. Let's, I'm not gonna do that. Ignore this. We're adding 0 for whatever reason, because I had some things plugged in there, obviously. So we remap this, and then we're adding this to the wind strength. And I'm not just adding it, because then if I say like a wind strength variation, like right now 550, then obviously we're always going to end up with everything completely flat. What I do instead is I say I multiply the wind strength with this, and then add this to the wind strength itself. So it's more like a percentage, right? So 550 is not going to turn everything flat to the ground, but it's just going to multiply the wind strength. And you can see here what, obviously if I increase this, yeah, it's still a percentage, because it also goes in both directions. Kind of starting to think this could also be used for waves. Yeah, maybe later. And here I'm kind of doing it twice, but this time I call it jitter frequency and jitter strength. It's exactly the same. Obviously, as I mentioned before, this would be the perfect scenario for a subgraph, but yeah, then you only see this is what a subgraph unfortunately looks like. If I click this and you go in there, and then it's just, it gets confusing, at least for a tutorial. So this way I can have like 2, and then I use 1 for like the overall, like the big wind direction, and I use the jitter frequency to have them like jitter a little bit, so they're kind of like jiggling. Obviously I'm way more subtle with this and use a much higher frequency, right? And so here we can of course make it jitter, right? So it's a higher frequency, and yeah. So by overlaying these two effects, I think you can get some pretty nice wind effects. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to go through everything here. So, for example, here I'm doing a direction variation, right? Once again, would use a subgraph, just to make sure they're not always rotating exactly the same, but I can say, like, let's just rotate them. Once again, with a noise texture, I want the X and the Z value have a bit of variation in there, just to make it look more natural. But let's talk about one more thing, and that is the effect, like the crop circle, which you can already see. Right, so I have a float here, revealed sign, goes from 0 to 1, kind of doing something similar where I'm saying I don't want to have like absolute values. I only want to end up with a value between 0 and 1. So I mentioned before, I'm adding this. This is where the effects come in. So here, all these things I do with the wind, like the jittering, the strength and that's going to come in here. And then I clamp this to 0 and 9. And this way I can say, you know what, if I want to have them completely flat on the ground, I need to add something a little bit more to get to 1. And this is where all these effects come in. The first thing we need to do is check that the object center is covered by the sign. And to do that, I say 0, 0 of the object and convert it to a world position. Then I take the X and Z, right, because we just converted it. And now, once again, I need to say, okay, where would that X and the Z be on a texture if I place the texture on an X and Z plane on the ground? Which, I mean, you can see the texture, I think, quite clearly here. So we have to do this. I can use I could use the normal node that I used quite a lot here, the position wide and set it to world. This, however, refers to every vertex of the mesh, and I had that in the beginning. The problem is then you have some crops that are like half into this, and then like half of the crop it's gonna get flat on the ground and the other half is jiggling in the wind, and it just looks really weird. So I decided instead, let's just check, is the crop inside, is this like on the texture or not? If it is, then we're gonna have the effect, otherwise we don't. And this is why I use this node, the transform. And I say 0, 0, 0, white, that's the object. Convert it to world position, split it, map it to this one. Here I use the tiling and offset. Here I can use the scale, white, just divide it a little bit. Offset, like just the vector 2. I can move it to the side, to the left, yeah. And I thought maybe I want to rotate it. Kind of do want to do that, maybe for an animation. I think it looks cool if, let's see if the sparkles, maybe if the sparkles start right and you have this like it's starting to rotate first and then it's kind of locking down. Maybe they're scanning the ground. That's a good landing position. I don't know. Rotate this, and here we go with the sample texture 2D, right? So here we made sure that we mapped everything to an X and Z, and now we can plug that in. And here, this design texture, sample texture 2D, all this goes into the UV. And I'm checking the alpha, because it's an alpha texture, or rather it has alpha values, right, wherever it is white. Let's see if I find shaders, wind with signs, alien sign. Okay, if you look here, so RGBA, if I click the alpha channel, right, so 0, black, and white gives me 1. And then I say if this, like if the crop, if the position, and I map this onto the ground, if this right there, when you sample the texture here, which unfortunately doesn't show me, if the alpha value here is bigger than 0.9, I want it to be true, otherwise false. The reason I'm not using alpha directly is because it's not every pixel is exactly full opacity or not, and then you get this weird issue again where some might be 0.7. Even if I set the filter mode to nothing, but still the original image texture doesn't have perfect 0 or 100 alpha values, right? So just to make sure, this works quite nicely, 0.9. And so I use this branch to kind of clean it. Yeah, I get 1 if it's true and false. I multiply this with this revealed sign. That's the slider I just showed you. Gonna get, oh wait, this is the scene. Let's check this one. Yeah. So here we have the revealed sign slider, right? And then I multiply this. So basically I'm multiplying 0 with 0 for everything that is outside of the alpha values. And it only gets applied to the ones that are actually inside, like the white values, they are covered. So I multiply this, and this is where I'm adding this. And this is how I get the flattening on the ground, right? Because I'm saying make them lerp even sooner. And let me, maybe if I remove the color. Unfortunately, it doesn't have opacity, but I think it might be visible, might be easier to see here if I reveal the sign. So as you can see here, so I'm just saying do all of this like kind of like add a lot of wind strength to it. So they are getting flatted even sooner, but they're still reacting to the wind strength. But of course, if I say revealed sign 1 fully, then even at 0 wind strength, right, we're still adding 1. So they're getting to 1. And so we have this sign in here. Yeah, so about the color. So first of all, good news, I just realized a lot of that stuff was old and not even used anymore. So this is a little bit simpler with the color here. Let me move that around and this here, and yeah. So now, of course, first of all, this is based on if it's even covered by the sign, right? Once again, I want to know if it's, I don't want to have any effect if it's not covered by the sign. So I get this 0 and 1 and I multiply this. So if they're not covered, then this is going to be 0, and whatever I do here, all of this is going to be 0. And also use the revealed sign here, so the 0 to 1 slider, but I don't want to have it gradual, because that would mean that when I'm at 0 and they're flat on the ground, now they're all glowing, but I kind of want this to be like while it's happening, right? This is like they're using some crazy energy magic to make this flat on the ground. But now they're flattened, now they don't need that anymore. And so once again, I'm using my awesome gradient. If I haven't mentioned it, I only do that because there aren't any curves yet. And once they are, I'm not going to use these gradients, just to work on it. But once again, I can do revealed sign. It's going to be between 0 and 1. So if it's 0, I get whatever alpha value I have here, right? I sample the color, split it, so I only care about the alpha. And let's look at the gradient. And this is really nice to fine tune it. So I say, when revealed sign is 0, I want to have 0. When it is at 32%, I want to have full alpha. This where the full glow effect is going to be here. Then I don't want anything in the end. And I can very easily tweak this, and I say, you know what? I actually want to glow this a lot more almost towards the end, but take a longer build up. And I can do this. And if I save the asset, now it's going to behave a bit differently, right? So I have this longer build up, and now it's fully glowing for quite a while, and then much closer to the end, it's going to go to 0. And what exactly is happening here is, right, so I'm getting a value between 0 and 1 out. As I mentioned, multiply this if it's even covered by this sign. And if it is, then here we're going to do a remap. Right, we're getting a value between 0 and 1 out of this. And I remap this to max sign glow. Let me explain this first, sorry. So I have a simple noise here. I don't plug in anything into the UV for, I think, the only time in this entire graph. And that means it's just going to use the UV of the mesh, actually. Right, whatever I unwrapped it in Blender in this case, or whatever object you have, it has an UV map. And so I just take this one. I map the noise onto the UV texture. And here I want to use the step, where the step is just anything that is between above a certain value is going to be revealed, right? So if I say 0, I should say everything that is below a certain value is going to be revealed. So if it's 0, why don't we get more and more and more? And this is why I use this max sign glow, because if I just plug in 1, right, it's just going to glow way too much. So I have this max sign glow. And what I'm doing here is what I got out of here, right? What I'm getting out of here is the value between 0 and 1. Once again, 0 here, 1, and 0 in the end. I'm getting this out of here, and I use this remap node. I know I'm getting 0 to 1 in. What I want to get out is the value between 0 and this max sign glow. So I think, yeah, something like 0.3, whatever, like 0.4. I can use this to find a good value. That should be enough. Right, plug this in. And of course, multiply this with a glow color and plug this into the emission. And this is pretty much it. Right now, if I increase the max sign glow, I'm changing this value here, right, the step node, because I'm remapping it to a different value. If I do this, however, like 0.58, as you've seen, 0.58 on a simple noise, because once again, it does not go from 0 to 1, it goes from 0 to like 0.7, which I think this actually proves it nicely. Kind of wonder if it does that if I make it gigantic. I think even then we're getting to pure white, pretty quickly. I guess technically you can find some black spots, but yeah. Oh yeah, here of course you can also use the noise, right? Let's do it like this. It's like this. No, sorry, I should. And yeah, as you can see, a very subtle glow. Little bit too much. Wait, why is everything glowing? Oh, okay, so yeah, I think this is more like a new kind of crop. If I don't use this remap, then I don't have the check if they're covered by the sign. So now everything is glowing, but let's go back in here. But now, of course, the sparkles, they're a bit different. Actually, I kind of like that more, to be honest. Yeah, so the sign is going to increase the sparkle and then the glow, and now they're flat on the ground, and now the aliens know where to land, and the farmer probably knows he's in trouble. Yeah, that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Again, it's on GitHub, just get the link, play around with it. Let me know if you have any questions. There are a bunch of other things, but here I darken it, bend it down a bit more, change the direction. Yeah, I didn't want to cover everything in here. Also have some stretching, because if you rotate it, it kind of gets squashed. That's a different issue. I think that would be better for a standalone tutorial, so I can stretch them to kind of account for that too. And yeah, lots and lots of things. Let me know if you have questions. Also, if you have requests for like other tutorials you would like to see. And I'm also very open to like feedback, criticism, how I can improve these tutorials. I hope they're not like too confusing. Yeah. Okay, thanks for watching and goodbye.